They say confession is good for the soul. I don't know about souls. I'm just a man who used to do bad things, and tonight I'm telling you about 4 of them. 4 nights that followed the rough logic of my choices and then turned on me in ways I couldn't have predicted. This is me, the bad guy, speaking plain. I won't ask you to forgive me. I just want you to hear what happened. The first one is the one I think about most. Not because it was the worst. I did my share of petty, ugly things before that night, but because it almost ended me. I was a road predator in the most boring way possible. Not a mastermind, not someone who fancied himself a movie villain. I cruised back roads at night, looking for people who looked like they could be fooled. Older couples, porch lights left on wrong, cars limping along the shoulder. I'd park somewhere with a clear view, pretend I was having trouble, and wait for somebody to stop. Mostly they'd open the door with that slow worry someone gets when they think they might be a neighbor who needs help. You learn to read that worry like a map. There are rules I made for myself. Pathetic, I know, but rules anyway. Don't hurt them. Don't take anything you can't walk away from in one trip. Never take photographs or anything that could identify them later. No sentimental boxes, no heirlooms. If they offer money, take it and be gone. If they don't, fake being fixed and drive off. That was it. Low stakes. I told myself low stakes meant low guilt. Turns out guilt doesn't work that way. It stacks. The ritual was part of the high. You get into a rhythm, park under a silver moon, kill your lights, watch the house until the curtains move. You can feel the town breathing at 2 a.m., the hush of windows, the distant thump of a dog with nothing to bark at. You choose a house that has an easy stoop, a porch light with a crooked bulb, a mailbox with someone's name weathered off so you can't Google it. You rehearse your voice in the car until it's right, low, harmless, the voice of someone with a flat tire who needs a hand. On the night that broke the pattern, I found a place that looked like all the rest. 2-story house, little light bathing the shrubs, a mailbox. The woman who opened the door was older than most of my marks, but not weak the way I'd expected. She had that economy of movement elderly people can have, every action measured, like she'd practiced saving her strength. The man beside her loomed like a giant that had shrunk over years, but there was muscle in him still. He didn't smile. He didn't offer coffee. He stood as if he'd been waiting for something for a long time, his hands empty except for a hunting rifle that felt wrong in the porch light. I say wrong because it was a normal presence in his hands, not theatrical. The rifle looked cared for, the strap was worn, the wood polished where hands had patted it. It wasn't the kind of weapon held by a thrill-seeker. It was a tool that had spent decades doing its job. That detail stuck with me. I thought of him as giant because my mind needed a place to put him. The woman was small, but not frail in the way I'd lured in before. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't crease the eyes. It contained everything, calm and something else I couldn't name. I knocked like I always did. My mouth had a script. "Hey, sorry to bother you. I'm having trouble with my car. Could you—" It had a practiced casualness that passed for truth, and sometimes it did. This time it did not. When she leaned forward to look at my face, a smell hit me, and I remember it the way you remember an alarm. Thick, wet, like something old left to rot in a cellar. I don't know why that sticks so sharply. Maybe because it contradicted the tidy porch. Maybe because I found it impossible to read. The smell made my skin crawl, and I could feel my palms slick inside my jacket. The man's gaze didn't move from me. He didn't ask a question. He didn't need to. I had been careful. I wasn't the kind of thief who went in knowing he'd meet a gun. I'd always tried to pick easy marks precisely to avoid this. When the rifle shifted lightly in his hands, something else shifted inside me. Fear isn't dramatic. It has a slow, hydraulic pressure. I could feel the old familiar calculations, the car ticket, the way I'd leave empty-handed if the house generated any resistance. But the smell, the rifle, the woman's smile, all of it pushed against the neat boxes my rules tried to place the world into. "You're late," she said. "Not a question, not a complaint." "Sorry?" I asked stupidly, like I hadn't been the one knocking at her door. "You shouldn't be out here at this hour," she said. The man moved a step forward. His boots barely made a sound. The porchboard gave a tiny complaint under his weight. I tried to backpedal. I tried to tell the little lie about a blown tire and a phone that died, the lines I had said 100 times. My voice came out thin. They didn't take the bait. The woman closed the door behind them without a glance. It clicked in a way that set the world into a single, terrible smallness. Then the porch light dipped, as if the bulb had exhaled, and the giant and the woman guided me onto their drive with the slow courtesy of hosts, inviting the wrong person to sit at the wrong table. They didn't speak again for a long moment. The man with the rifle watched me like a hawk, waiting to see if a rabbit would twitch. The woman, when she finally spoke, did something I hadn't expected. She asked me my name, not for the police or for a log, but like you ask a person who fits into a story you've been reading aloud. I told her a name I wasn't. I lied as easily as I'd done everything else, and I can lie in a cadence that sounds true. She folded that name into a nod, and then reached into a small drawer by the door and pulled out an old yellow pad. She turned it to a blank page, wrote something with careful letters, tore it away, and held it up like she was showing me a photograph. The paper had a single word on it, not my name, not anything legible from where I stood. A child's handwriting, maybe, or a hurried scrawl. I didn't want to read it, but I couldn't help it. The word was leave. The guns never left the porch. The man never did anything but stand. Their eyes kept me contained. I told myself to laugh, to make fun of the whole thing, to say this was a bad joke. My mouth refused to lift. The air had the density of a threat that didn't need to be shouted. There were no threats. Instead, there were possibilities, and my imagination filled in the worst. I turned to my car and felt my stomach go loose in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Somewhere in the walk back, my tire hit a metal shard, or maybe it was a nail. I don't know, and I don't want to know. But when I put the key in, the engine thudded, and the car didn't want to start. I didn't hear anything come from behind me, but I felt a change, an alteration in the porchlight's mood. The man stepped off the stoop and walked the length of his yard like he was clearing a path. He didn't run. He didn't curse. He moved with a slow confidence that makes animals freeze. I remember the first sprint because it was ugly and ridiculous and entirely human. The instant decision not to get out of the car and stand and try to be clever. I started it. The car lurched. I couldn't get the engine to catch. I pulled the door open and shoved myself in because the only useful thing was distance. The tires wept rubber onto the gravel as I tried to get a hold on nothing. Then I saw the slash marks down the side of one tire. Someone had gone out to my car while I was at the porch. Someone had been faster or had been waiting. The roar of it in my head was a simple, vulgar thing. You are a target now. I left the car there and ran. I know that sounds like a coward's move. Call it what you want. I ran into the woods because the woods felt like possibility. The map of horrible options blurred. I ran barefoot through old leaves that flopped against my calves. Branches slapped my arms. My lungs burned. I could hear the careful steps behind me, the snap of leaves that told me they were not chasing, with the reckless abandon of a man who had simply lost his temper. They were moving and thinking, like someone had time to plan the way it would feel when they found me. At some point, I dropped to the ground to listen. That's when the sound came closest. A voice I couldn't place in the dark called a name that sounded like mine. It wasn't the name I'd given them. It was thin and intimate and had my father's cadence in it. The call was careful, a single syllable that made me want to answer and made me more afraid because answering would mean surrender. I crawled deeper. My hands found a ditch. The wet mud felt like truth under my nails. I stayed there until the moon wore down and the sky began to think about morning. I crawled back to the car at the first light because I wanted my keys, my wallet, anything I could still possess. The tires were shredded. There were footprints around the vehicle, not mine, heavy and spaced, like someone who was used to walking with a purpose. Near the trunk, someone had left an object, a single bright thing placed like a toy. It could have been coincidental. I've learned since that coincidence has a way of looking like a message to people like me. I shoved it into my jacket and drove away with as much dignity as a man can muster when he's leaving his life behind. Advice I should have taken: report it, call the police, tell someone what happened. Did I? No. I wanted to sleep with the choices I made, not magnify them with a report. I told myself I was lucky to be alive. I told myself other, worse things. That the people on that porch were monsters in their own right, that they had set me up, that maybe they'd done worse to others. Whatever narrative fit became the one I believed the easiest. That night changed me quicker than any lecture or jail time might have. For a long time after, every porch light made me look over my shoulder. Every old woman with a measured gait made me slow and swallow. The sense that someone, something, could answer my name from the dark stuck to me like tar. I stopped driving those roads. I stopped choosing easy marks. The fear didn't purify me. It only taught me a new rule: avoid being where others can see you as prey. If the universe was going to punish me, it was going to do it quietly and privately, which made it worse. I keep replaying the way the woman smiled. I keep thinking about the torn scrap of paper she offered, the way it said one small, unreadable thing. Was it a warning, a prayer, a game? I will never know. All I know is the smell, the rifle, the porch, and the way the world contracted to a single instruction that wasn't spoken but was obeyed anyway. Get away. If you like confessions like this, ugly, close, and true, subscribe. I don't do this for praise. I do it because the truth is a kind of weight that needs telling. The second story begins in fluorescent light and stale air. I worked nights at a strip mall for a while, just long enough to learn the pattern of fluorescent hums. Nights feed you a rhythm. The automatic sprinklers click, the HVAC sighs, the parking lot empties in one long exhale, and the convenience store light buzzes like it's hallucinating. My job was simple in description: walk the lot, check the doors, keep the cameras happy. In practice it was empty and perfect. An 8-hour shift where the only company was the glow of the monitor, and the occasional trucker who'd pull in for coffee and something salty. You can get used to nothing if you have nothing else. Boredom is a dangerous thing because it invents small sins to make the time stick. I didn't start stealing because I needed money. I started because the mall put out boxes of lost merchandise, a pair of boots here, an old phone there, and nobody looked disappointed when something went missing. I told myself I was rescuing things from being forgotten. I took one pair of shoes at first, then another. Tiny things, soft crimes that felt like tests. Nobody calls the cops for a pair of sneakers taken off a back shelf in the middle of the night. There are blind spots in every system, and cameras are honest liars. They show what they're pointed at and ignore the rest. I learned where the cameras left room and how the store layouts made safe corners where human hands could move undetected. I learned the mental map of the mall, where the cameras overlapped, where the human eye didn't bother. The thrill was the nimble work of not being seen, the small gratitude you feel when you walk away with something nobody would miss until morning. You don't imagine the guilt arriving like a person at the door. Guilt is quieter. It nudges you in the dark, then waits for you to notice. It can make a laugh hollow, make your hands itch. It can also do worse things, make you listen harder than you should. That listening is what brought me to the moment that undid me. The first night it happened, I was walking the perimeter with my flashlight, and the key ring heavy in my hand. The lot was a black pool with pinpricks of distant traffic. The strip mall itself looked like a sleeping animal. I passed the pet groomer with its posters of smiling poodles. The nail salon with its faded gold lettering, the closed cafe whose smell of coffee and sugar clung to the bricks. There was a children's play area between two storefronts, a little plastic slide, and a bench. I remember the bench because the night smelled like dryer lint and candy dust from the arcade a block over, and something about that smell made the air feel too full. It started with a sound I hadn't expected, a high, thin laugh, like a child laughing on the other side of a wall. There were no children on that side of town at 3 a.m., no kids riding bikes under streetlights. The laugh was small, unsure, like someone testing a consonant. I froze. The flashlight beam fell short. I walked toward it because I was a person who moved into things, maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of the need to prove I wasn't afraid of my own place. The cameras showed nothing. On screen there was only the smear of the night and the occasional passing headlight. I walked the walk-through route and checked the doors. Locked. The laugh threaded the air again, closer, whispering up through the vents or sliding from behind a shutter. I checked the monitor and rewound the tape. There was nothing but static and my own hands moving like a puppet on screen. I saw myself fumble with the keys, saw my breath fog on the glass in the camera's lower right corner. I saw nothing else. People ask if I thought I'd gone insane. At first I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Boredom will do that. Fill the quiet with nonsense to make you interesting. But when something starts to call your name, you stop being charitable. It happened later, after I'd been taking things more often, that a voice, clear as a bell and closer than anything rational, spoke my name across the lot. No one was there. No one was visible on any camera I checked. It didn't matter. The sound cinched around me like an accusation. I told the supervisor. I should have. He listened with that polite skepticism people in power keep for night workers who report weird. He didn't look at the monitors like he believed me. He looked at the evidence I couldn't hide. That day, when he opened his office door, he gasped and then said nothing. On my desk had appeared a pair of children's shoes, bright purple, too small for any of the staff. I didn't put them there. I hadn't found them. It must have been the most damning thing possible. Someone had walked into the mall while I was supposed to be watching, and left evidence that would suggest I had been hiding the goods. "You sure you didn't bring these in?" he asked in that flat voice that meant he thought you had a problem. "I didn't," I said. I wanted to say 100 things. I wanted to explain how the cameras told me I was alone. I wanted to tell him about the laughing. Instead, I watched him look at the monitors and see only me. The only thing the cameras showed was me, walking in little begins and ends, a man with a flashlight moving like a mannequin in a child's diorama. The first time the laughter wove around me, it was a trick of the night. The second time, there was the shape of footsteps in places that should have been empty. The smell was the same, old popcorn butter and the sweet chemical tang you get from the back of a thrift store. I couldn't catch where the sound wanted to live. It seemed to take joy in being in two places at once, the echo in the supply closet and the hollow of the hallway. Sometimes the monitor would flick to a grainy image and show nothing, and sometimes it would focus on me, making my face look huge and stupid. Once, it showed a small figure darting behind a pillar, and the camera glitched to static so fast I could have sworn it was more than coincidence. There is a point where being clever stops being interesting and turns into something else. For me, that point came when I started to become the story. People talk about how criminals imagine themselves as invisible. I wasn't invisible. I was visible in the worst possible way. The camera had a funny sense of humor and liked to put me on full screen like a clown in the middle of an empty theater. I found the stolen goods in my locker one morning with price tags still clinging and a note folded into a paper towel. Stop. I tried to rationalize. Maybe the mall had a prankster. Maybe a bored teenager liked making security guards jump. Maybe it was a projection of my own guilt. The thing about guilt is that when you live in it, you start to look for it everywhere. But then the voice started to speak to me by name while I was alone in the parking lot doing a perimeter check. It didn't shout. It didn't even use anger. It said my name like someone turned a key in a lock and went away pleased. That night, I watched the footage, rewound, enhanced, and watched until the pixels blurred. The camera showed me walking, lit by a square sodium light, like a man in a bowl of cheap moonlight. No little figure, no shadow beyond the column of my body. I rewound 3 times, and on the 3rd pass the audio track had a whisper in it. Something soft enough to be a gust of wind or someone breathing into a cup, and the caption on the security log had an entry I didn't make. A door had been opened, though I had checked the locks. My supervisor shrugged and gave me a look that meant more trouble than help. People without options hand you looks like that when they want you to resign quietly. I didn't resign at first. I tried to be braver than the thing that laughed. I told myself there was an explanation, mice in vents, a faulty mic, a neighbor running late with kids. The more I tried to explain it away, the less the explanation fit. The place I used to search for blind spots suddenly felt like a stage where I was meant to stay and perform. The cameras that had once been blind to me now found me like a magnet. At night, I'd watch the monitors and see my figure on screen. Then those same screens would show me moving my hands in ways I didn't remember doing. Once, the footage captured me picking up a toy and placing it on the desk. I never did that. I watched myself on playback and almost believed that someone else had slipped into me for a moment. The thing that eroded any joke left was the way the laughter began to sound like children who had been hurt and were now playing a game they should not have learned. It wasn't cruel at first. It was more like a child's curiosity gone wrong. But there was malice folded into it, a smugness. The night something called my name by the deli entrance, I walked toward the sound and felt the hairs on my forearms lift. The strip mall's lights were a comfortable hum, the kind that makes you think of fluorescent foods in hospital cafeterias. I could see the bulge of my monitor backpack in the dark, the way my own shadow stretched and swallowed the painted lines on the asphalt. "Sam," it said, not a shout, just a single syllable that sounded like someone who'd been practicing my name for a long time. My heart stumbled. For a second I thought someone had learned my name from the lost and found log, or from the supervisor's clipboard. But no one should have known me like that. I wasn't a famous man. I was a man who kept hours and walked in boxes. The call came from somewhere between the laundromat and the shuttered bookstore, where cameras didn't exist, or at least they pretended not to. If there is one honest confession left that I didn't want to make publicly, it's that the thing that held me the longest wasn't the fear of being caught for theft. It was the idea that something else could watch me and know me in the way I'd known other people, intimately and without mercy. For weeks, I felt like a character in a story that had read the last page and decided to change the ending. At the end of one shift, after I found another item I didn't take tucked under my coat, a tiny plastic horse with one leg missing and a note that said, "We see," I quit. The supervisor didn't make me. He watched me gather the few things I owned and nodded once, like a man who had always expected this. I told myself I'd leave to find a better life. I told myself I needed to be away from the place that watched. I drove off with the radio on too loud, as if sound could drown the memory of laughter threaded into the night. But you don't just leave things like that. I kept hearing the laughter in grocery store aisles when a kid ran past. I kept catching movement at the corner of my eyes in my apartment, a blur of small feet. The monitors at the strip mall still flicker in the back of my head. When I close my eyes, I see the camera's grainy circle and my face in the middle of it like a target. The last thing I remember before I walked out for good was checking my locker and seeing a child's shoe waiting for me. It was old, scuffed, absurdly small. No price tag, no identifying snap. It's the kind of token that means someone else knows how to get under your skin. I stuffed it into my bag and walked past the lights one last time. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. That night as I drove away, the rearview mirror held the reflection of the mall, a rectangle of light, and, for a small, impossible second, I thought I saw the figure of a child standing at the farthest edge of the lot, hands in its pockets, watching me leave like someone who had won a game. The distance made it impossible to read. By the time I blinked, the figure was gone, or my headlights had simply been a trick. Either way, I drove until the map of the city changed, and the mall's hum became just another background fact in my life. I told myself the story ended there. I told myself the only thing that had happened was I had seen things my guilt made up. But guilt is a lens as much as it is a punishment. Once you let it tint the glass of your life, everything goes through that color. You see threats where there are none, love where there is kindness, conspiracies where coincidence is settler. Maybe that's what happened to me. Maybe I had been the one who made those shadows, or maybe someone, or something, who had nothing to do with my petty crimes decided I'd made a good entertainment. I went home to my tiny apartment, and for a while the silence there was different. It was not the silence of nothing. It had a press to it, like the hush before a storm. I would fall asleep and wake to the echo of small shoes on linoleum. I would wake and think I heard the whisper of my name under the door. I kept telling myself to be brave and sane. I kept telling myself the only danger I'd made for myself was the one I'd always deserved. And yet, one night as I sat there making a grocery list, the doorbell rang. It rang once, politely, the way a neighbor might knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I didn't open the door because part of me knew what would happen if I did. What I did was this. I looked out the peephole. The hallway was empty. There was nothing on the mat. The light outside the unit flicked. I waited, and then, because curiosity is stubborn, I stepped out to the landing and looked down. There, sitting plainly on the floor across from my door, was a pair of purple sneakers. They were the same as the ones I'd found earlier, not dirty, not abandoned, placed there like an offering. On the laces someone had tied a small knot and tucked a folded paper into it. My hands trembled. I could feel my life narrowing to that single thought. Someone had been in the hall without me hearing them. Someone had put something where only I would see it. I didn't open the note. I left the shoes where they were and moved to my car and drove straight to my parents' place an hour away. I packed in a night and stayed on the couch like a child. I told myself I'd wait a few days, let the thing pass. I told myself all the plausible things. Every plausible thing is a poor companion when your nights are full of laughter that isn't yours. When I talk to you now, I'm telling you I still don't know if I deserved what happened. I only know that foolish crimes can attract attention, and attention isn't always the kind you want. I don't know if what followed was caused by guilt or by something that liked the sound of my name. I only know the small, familiar terror of shoes placed at your door. It won't leave you quickly. I was supposed to move on. I was supposed to leave it behind. But things have a way of unfurling after we've done what we thought was the worst of them. The mall, the lights, the laughter. They didn't stop being real because I stopped working nights. They lingered like stains. I thought leaving would be enough to put the memory in a drawer. It wasn't. And then, one night, I heard something at the window of my parents' house, a childlike knocking and a soft whisper of my name carried through the eaves. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they were children, or a group mocking me, or my guilt dressing itself as an enemy because it wanted me to feel hunted. But I froze, and not because I thought the law had found me, but because something else had learned to speak to me, the way I'd once spoken to other people when I needed them to move. I stayed at my parents' for a few nights. It felt safer, but safety is relative. The sound never exactly formed into a face I could point to. It sat in corners, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the tiny things like the squeak on the back stairs. I checked locks I had never checked before. I noted that the blind spots in life are social things too, the places we assume are safe because someone else is there. This isn't the end. I haven't told you all of it. There are nights when the laugh finds me even here. There are times when I watch my own hands in a mirror, wondering if the person in the glass is my own actor playing a role someone else wrote. There are small tokens left, where I used to live and now where I sleep at my parents' house. A toy on the porch, a shoe at the entry, a scribbled line on a note that says nothing and everything at once. I don't leave you with neat answers. What happened in the strip mall was half paranoia and half reality, and I didn't want to test which half was which. The fear of being the thing you once were, the predator being turned into prey, tastes of iron and small charity. It makes you measure out the days like coins and hope the count comes out even. The laughter was not finished with me, and I wasn't finished with the story. On a different night, months later, the life I'd built from petty theft and daring would come back to bite me in a way I hadn't pictured, not in some cinematic showdown, but in the form of an old instinct I thought I'd buried. I won't tell you all of it now. There is a remaining piece to this that will follow, a night that changes how I see the whole pattern. It begins with a heavy smell, in a way that reminds me of a porch that wasn't meant for my kind, and it ends with a choice between running and standing. But before we go on, you should know something. We like to imagine karma as a straight line. You do a bad thing, and the universe balances a ledger. Real life rarely works like balances. It works like noises in the dark, like the feel of being watched when you thought you were alone. It works like that for a long time, before you realize the watching has learned your name. It works like noises in the dark, like the feel of being watched when you thought you were alone. It works like that for a long time, before you realize the watching has learned your name. The night that finished the mall for me smelled wrong the moment I stepped into the lot. You know the way a place can keep a memory in the grout and in the gutters? The mall had kept something, not just the leftover popcorn and motor oil, but an undercurrent like wet cardboard left in the rain. It tugged at the back of my throat the same way the porch that cut me once had. I parked in the shadow of the closed cafe and let the engine tick down. The whole world was that thin, late-night glaze, sodium lights, and the distant hiss of freeway traffic. I had told myself the mall was over, that I'd quit clean, but debt is a poor teacher, and curiosity is a worse one. I went back because sometimes you go back to the scene of the crime not for money, but to remind yourself how small you can be. I didn't plan to steal. I told myself I was only checking for missed things, for closure, for a trap I could identify and avoid. I had the flashlight in my hand more because my fingers needed something to do than because I really needed to search. Everything was the same, and everything was off. The playground's plastic slide looked like a child's throat under the streetlight. The bench had a wet ring like someone had sat there and cried, or been sick. And then I smelled it, heavy, green, the kind of rot that sits under leaves through the winter. I stopped. The smell had a fellow traveler in my chest recall. I thought of the porch and the woman and the rifle and the scrap of paper. I thought of a name called in a voice that found something in me I couldn't admit. I moved toward the back alley between the shuttered bookstore and the laundromat, because the sound had come from there the last time. The alley was a flat black slit with dumpsters and the occasional graffiti flaring white in the flashlight. I told myself if someone wanted me, they would say so in a way that a rational person would accept. I told myself a lot of things. You do, when you want to be brave. There was a toy sitting on the top of a dumpster, one of those cheap plastic cars with the paint half worn off. It shouldn't have been there. The thing about tokens is this. They're never neutral. They're a translation of attention. Some person had thought about me enough to place plastic where my light would find it. Next to the car was a note folded into a cigarette pack. I almost laughed at the melodrama of it, the cliché of an urban legend, but my hand shook when I picked it up. The note had 3 words. We remember you. That's different from the scraps I had seen before. Remember has the soft cruelty of history. It's not a threat as much as an assertion. Someone had decided that my past deserved a memory. For the first time since the first shoes and the first note at the strip mall, something in me that wasn't the petty thief shrugged off and listened. There was a knock at the far end of the alley, a tempered, ordinary knock, like someone tapping their knuckles on metal to call a friend. I stooped and slipped the car into my pocket and walked toward the sound because cowards don't always run. Sometimes they step forward to see who cares enough to tap. A small figure stepped from the shadow. I say small because it was small compared to the adult men I had come to expect in nights like that. A child would have been terrifying. So would a person dressed to look like a child. The figure had the odd gait of someone whose knees were too close for an adult, and it held itself like a thing trying to look at me politely. "Hey," it said. The voice had no malice. It had something rehearsed. "We just wanted to know when you'd be back." I couldn't tell if my mouth gave a smile or if my face simply rearranged into a grimace. The figure didn't come closer. It stayed in the periphery, where the light bled out and didn't quite touch skin. Names are small tools people use when they want to make you assume they belong to a neighborhood. The figure didn't know my name, not that night, not in a way I could catch. It only had curiosity and the nerve to ask for a schedule. "What do you say to that?" I might have told you 100 ways to walk away after this, but in the moment, time was a small coin, and I spent it foolishly. "I'm done," I said. It was less an announcement than a plea. The figure cocked its head like an animal listening for a rustle. "You leaving?" it asked. The thing that broke me wasn't sudden violence. It was the idea of being watched that had outlived its joke. There was care in the way whoever this was had planned tokens and notes. There was a patience that felt older than mine. It turned the hunter into the thing being hunted, without spectacles or dramatic reveal. It was the same quiet method they'd used at the porch, the same slowness and the same economy. No theater, no shouting, just enough to ensure I knew someone had read me. I left again. That night I shoved my flashlight into the glove box, shoved the toy under the passenger seat, and drove with every passing thought a kind of static that made it hard to hold the wheel. I told myself I was lucky, or stubborn, or both. I told myself I would stop, which I did mostly. I didn't go back to the mall. I didn't go back to the roads. But sometimes the body remembers how to move before the mind has forgiven it, and sometimes your past is a magnet that keeps tugging. Whatever it was that watched me at the mall and by the porch, it wasn't interested in a lecture. It didn't need to justify itself. It left me with the idea that consequences aren't always red and flashing. Sometimes they're patient and domestic. They slip notes into trash cans and toys onto dumpsters and wait for your face to register the math. They have the long patience of people who've learned how to sit in the dark until the person who once sat in light returns to fill the space. There are other nights and other kinds of shame. A different kind sits in classrooms and feeds on attention rather than on objects. I met Emily in a boring, half-promised class about media studies. She was the kind of person who laughed at things the rest of the group didn't find funny. She had a face made for candid photos, and when she smiled, she used her whole mouth. We were put in a group for a semester-long project that involved interviews and a flimsy mock documentary. I was bad at small talk, but good at paying attention without seeming to. She and I found a rhythm that started casual and edged into something more personal, because group projects make intimacy out of deadlines and the shared irritations of teachers who don't know how to grade cooperation. I told myself early on it was only a school thing. I told myself I was an adult and could keep boundaries, but there's a slippery logic to getting to know someone. You start with public things, posts, profile pictures, the small tags that say when someone is where, and if you are the kind of person who likes to solve for people, those public scraps look like permission. Emily posted the kind of life that invites curiosity. Weekend hikes, coffee at a corner place, a dog in a sweater. To my lonely brain, this was like reading someone else's journal and deciding it would be interesting to make a map. The first time I drove by her neighborhood, it was just a way to confirm a detail for the project, the angle for the interview, the best place to park. I told myself that and believed it for a minute. Then the minutes stacked. I started to collect her posts, the way some people collect seashells. I kept screenshots with the dates, the captions, the tiny comments she made. I wasn't planning to harm her or even to touch her door. I planned to know her the way a person knows a place they've lived in, intimately and thoroughly. There is a kind of arrogance in thinking a person is meant to be known fully and without permission. Obsessive behavior grows like mold in damp corners. It starts invisible and then spreads. I thought cataloging was just preparation. It wasn't. It was a way to have control when I felt small. It made me smarter about what she did and softer about what that meant. I told myself she was indifferent until she wasn't. I told myself reminding myself of that would be enough to stop. It wasn't. It escalated quietly. I followed social updates and mapped her coffee shops. I learned the time the library's doors opened and when the bakery down the block swapped out their muffins. I rationalized every action with the same soundbite. Everyone checks people online. No one is safe from being known. That didn't make it less invasive. It just made the invasion feel justified. The tipping point was small and stupid. She mentioned in class offhand that she'd felt like someone was watching her online, a benign laugh as she shrugged a shoulder and said, "Tech must be weird." She joked she felt like she had a secret admirer with a weird folder. The class laughed. I felt the world tilt. I'd never spoken to her about anything but the project. I'd never told her I had followed her more than the project needed. The confession in class felt like being named in public. The laugh made it worse, because it meant she was aware of the idea of a watcher, and I had a face in my mind that I tried to erase. After that, her glances at me elongated into small examinations. The way she smiled in the group chat felt like a test. The way she closed her laptop in the library felt like code. I became convinced, irrationally, that she was aware of me. It could have been guilt making me see things. It could have been paranoia. Or maybe someone else noticed and nudged her with something I couldn't see. She's the kind of person who notices details. I should have taken it as a signal to stop. Instead, fear flipped on me. I started to imagine someone else was watching her the way I had watched her. I imagined a stranger at her porch, a shadow slipping across her curtains. The idea of someone harming her because of my curiosity wrapped me in cold worry. I began to see the moral lines I'd already crossed with new horror, because I'd imagined they exposed her to danger. Belief and guilt can make a person act protectively in terrible, controlling ways. One night I came home to find my door had a scratch where a hand might have tried the knob. There were 3 firm knocks an hour later, not playful, not accidental, and then the kind of pounding that makes a living room feel like a drum. I thought of the worst possibilities, and then the more likely ones, a neighbor with anger, a prank. The knocks kept coming, and they had a rhythm I recognized as someone trying me out. I remember grabbing my phone and dialing nothing because I didn't want to call anyone and admit what I had done. I fled to my parents' house after that, the same cowardice that had carried me through the woods and past porches, now wrapped in shame and self-preservation. My mother made coffee and asked if I was sick. I lied. I told myself I'd explain later. Later is a terrible time to keep promises to people who deserve the truth. The worst night wasn't an accusation from law enforcement or a neighbor. It was the wide, stripped panic that comes when someone at the door knows you and you didn't expect them to. A hand had left a scrap of paper wedged under my door. Stop, or she will know. Nothing else. No signature, no flair. The simplicity of it broke me because it matched the method of all the tokens left across my life. Whether someone was teaching me to be afraid, or whether my past had finally found its way into my present, the point was the same. Someone knew enough to make me vulnerable. I don't know if Emily ever did learn the scope of what I had been. She moved away after the semester, or at least she said she did. I never told her how close I had come to crossing boundaries I couldn't salvage. I didn't tell her about the nights I sat outside the building she'd given as an interview location and pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and forced myself to breathe without moving. I didn't tell her that I had imagined her on porches and in backyards, and that my imagination had the cruelty of a tool. What I did tell myself is that I could stop. I thought leaving town would silence every little thing I had done, but little arcs of luck and shame have a way of not resolving neatly. The terror of being the person who makes another person vulnerable is heavier than any petty thrill I'd ever felt. The fear of being discovered is worse than discovery itself sometimes. At least, when the law closes a chapter, paper follows, and a kind of finality arrives. When someone watches and leaves tokens, and then moves on without consequence, the story never closes. I still think about the ordinary terror of the knocks on my door and the folded paper, and I still feel a kind of vertigo at the thought that human curiosity, when it becomes possession, will find its way back and bite. I regret the way I treated another person's life like a file to be read and then misfiled. I regret the arrogance that thought a person could be known without their consent. I regret the nights I let fear become my reason. If the mall and the porch taught me about patient consequences, the school project taught me something more intimate. When you pry into a life, you fracture it, and sometimes the fracture reaches back. Sometimes your violations become the seed of the hate you fear. You can't always tell which will come first, the guilt-made hallucinations or the people who genuinely know you. The worst part is not knowing which one is real. The last confession I have is the messiest. It started as a game and became an endurance test. My hands had always liked the thrill of being somewhere you shouldn't. I called it reverse theft because in the beginning it felt like art. Instead of taking things, I'd leave small, weird tokens in empty apartments. A single mismatched sock on the counter, a hair tie coiled on a coffee table, a daisy placed in a mason jar that had belonged to someone else. I'd watch the news and imagine the homeowner circling the missing item like a map, wondering who had been inside. I told myself it was a prank without violence, a whisper that said, "I was here." There is a particular kind of arrogance that treats objects as messages, and the first time I saw the small, unbalancing power of that, I laughed. I liked the tiny panic that spurred from finding something deliberately out of place. It made people tighten and check and maybe, for a brief moment, notice the fact of being observed. I told myself I left these things because I was bored, because it was theatrical, and because I liked to watch the pattern unfold. I never intended to threaten. I told myself I was careful. I only entered places that smelled lifeless, that had an air of vacancy, but carelessness has a way of changing names. The escalation was slow. I left a single note once, a scrap of paper with a child's drawing. That was a joke in my head. Then someone left me a note in return. "Stop playing." I thought it was a neighbor. I thought it was a target-blunted prank. It made me laugh and resentful all at once. I kept going. I liked the feeling of being clever. A small, messy thrill can get bigger until it feels like a pulse. The retaliation came in stages, as if the homeowners wanted me to see their range. First, a vase on my steps with a neatly folded note. "We know you." The handwriting was thin and careful. I told myself it was coincidence, that maybe a neighbor had found my mark and tried to be funny. The second time was a dead bird on my doormat. Not gruesome in detail, don't imagine anything I won't tell you, but it was a small, precise token of malice that felt personal. Someone had taken the trouble to procure and place it where I couldn't miss it. There was no blood in the story, I tell you, only the quiet horror of a relic meant to unsettle, meant to be read. I didn't think I could feel fear like that. The thrill-eater in me looked for an edge and found a flaw. I realized painfully that I'd been making a map of people's private spaces, and now someone had drawn one of mine. The birds and notes were harassment dressed as artistry. The apartment smelled like bitter coffee and old books the night I returned to pack the few belongings I still pretended mattered to me. I had a tiny plastic flower pinned to a coat I meant to take, baby's breath with one yellow petal, a single petal. Every token was a punctuation. When I came back to collect things after fleeing to my sister's couch for a night, the front door of my building was slightly ajar. That's a small detail that makes you stop, because doors that are not shut are invitations or warnings. I slipped inside, and the hallway felt like paper, thin, ready to tear. The kitchen table had a small envelope, and in it a single seed taped to the paper with the word, "We feed what we keep." Across the street, someone stood on their porch and watched me from the darkness. At first, I thought it was the neighbor I had sometimes waved to. Then I noticed the woman held a yellow flower in her hand, the kind I'd placed once on a cafe table as a joke. She didn't wave, she didn't call out. She just held the flower like a banner and watched me watch her. In my stomach, I had the old animal heat of being understood for the wrong reasons. I backed away and realized, with a cold clarity I hadn't felt before, that whatever mess I'd made wasn't anonymous. The thrill of unsettling someone becomes a thin skin once someone decides to unsettle you back. I imagined them watching which room I moved to, what I took out of boxes, where I left the trash. I imagined being recorded in a way I'd recorded others. I imagined the childish glut of tokens gathering like a chorus outside my life. The last straw was a note left under my sink, simple, typed from a cheap printer. "We are close. No flourish, no signature. Just proximity announced like a fact." Someone had taken the time to learn my movements. They had mapped my life without my consent, the way I had mapped other people's. The humiliation was doubled. I'd been the violator, and now the violated. I remember sitting in my car outside my building, the engine ticking and my hands flat on the steering wheel, and feeling the thinness of the world. Part of me wanted to go back inside and leave a message of my own. Threats, apologies, anything to reclaim control. The wiser, or maybe the more frightened part, didn't want to provoke whoever had decided this was a game. I took the flower I'd once left in a stranger's vase and imagined returning it and then burning it. I did neither. I drove. Across the street, the couple who watched me later reappeared on their porch. They stood there in the evening like judges who had been waiting their turn. The woman had a yellow flower pinned to her dress. The man had something that looked like a small scrap of lace tied around his wrist, the kind of gesture that looked symbolic if you want it to. I felt naked. I felt like a reflection someone else had taken the liberty of shining on my face. From then on, every time a door creaked late at night, I felt like someone had set up a stage just for me. What stopped me wasn't a beating or a police blot. It was the slow, invasive knowledge that someone who had no obligation to explain themselves had chosen me as a subject. Their methods were as domestic as mine had been, toys, notes, flowers, but their consequences were more terrifying because they were about being exposed. In the end, I gave up for a practical reason. I was tired of being afraid. I sold a few things, left a few things, and moved to a town where no one knew my laugh. That didn't solve the problem of being watched. The tokens didn't stop immediately. Sometimes you go to sleep and your hands still smell like someone else's salt, and you wake up and find a note in the pocket of a coat you thought you buried. All of this, the porch and the mall and Emily and the reverse theft, spirals around the same center, the predator whose prey learns to retaliate in human and inhuman ways. Whether the retaliation takes the form of a man on a porch with a rifle, a child's laughter in a camera that can't catch it, a piece of paper under a door, or a flower in a neighbor's hand, the effect is similar. There is a shift. The person who used to choose their targets now calculates how much light to let into their days. I tell these stories as confessions because confession forces something loose. I don't tell them to flatter myself or to seek pity. I tell them because a weight unshared grows harder. These nights changed me. They didn't make me saintly. They didn't erase all the small cruelties I committed or the first rationalizations I used to make them feel lighter. But they did make me count steps differently. They made me look at porches and think about what it means to be the one who knocks. They made me hear laughter and wonder whether it's private joy or a chorus above a scene you set for yourself. People like to think karma is tidy. They like stories where the ledger gets balanced and the moral is stamped. Real life is looser. Sometimes consequences are neat. Sometimes they are small, domestic and efficient. Sometimes they are a voice that gets your name right and uses it like currency. Sometimes nothing happens at all. The worst lesson is that you never know which it will be. I'm not reformed in the way saints are reformed. I wake some nights with the old muscle memory of a car door closing and the itch to see who is behind a curtain. But I have limits now I didn't used to have. I will not go near porches at night. I will not walk empty lots for the thrill of blind spots. I will not catalogue another person's life as if it were a library to be indexed. Those are small concessions. Maybe they're cowardly, maybe they're sensible. They are my truce. If there is one thing that ties all four of these nights together, it's the idea that being on top doesn't guarantee safety. People I've preyed upon didn't always deserve what they got, and neither do I deserve what I feared. The watchful world is not a single moral agent. It is a scattering of human beings who will respond in ways only they can justify. With guns, with laughter that nowhere appears on tape, with notes and flowers and dead things left like punctuation. The universe doesn't always act to punish. Mostly it acts to complicate. So I tell you this, not as redemption, but as witness. I am the bad guy in these stories. I am someone who chose easy targets, who enjoyed the small authority of being the watcher, who believed himself smart enough to stop before the world turned. That stopping didn't happen neatly. Instead, my past gathered itself and answered me in the language it preferred. Quiet and precise, domestic and cruel. I'm not asking you to excuse me. I don't want your absolution. What I want is the fact that it is said. I want someone to know that the small cruelties we commit can become the ways we are haunted. Maybe the people who watched me were angels, and maybe they were angry neighbors, and maybe they were something else entirely. I don't know, and I don't need to. Ambiguity keeps me honest, because certainty would let me lie. If one thing lingers from all of this, it is a cheap and terrible lesson. Anonymity is a kind of protection, and so is conscience. If you are watching someone now, if you are tempted to treat a life as a map you can read without permission, consider this the voice of someone who did and paid the cost. Maybe the cost will be nothing. Maybe it will be a note under your door. Maybe it will be worse. The point isn't what the punishment looks like. The point is that you will never be entirely comfortable again. Which one of these stories chills you the most? Tell me which in the comments. If you think there's value in hearing confessions told straight, give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear that boundaries matter, and subscribe for more first-person accounts you won't get anywhere else.